can be challenging. Sometimes they can be difficult. And sometimes they can be downright impossible to live with. The problem with those relationships, there can be many problems. Sometimes there's distance. Sometimes there's time. Sometimes we just don't communicate with people well. But the biggest impediment, I think, to a wonderful, clear relationship is our need to be right. So I took a look, and I'd like to examine a scripture with you. Please turn and take a look at Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. Why do you see the splinter which is in your brother's eye, and do not feel the beam which is in your own eye? And I'm reading from the Lamb's Aramaic translation. If you're using a different version, it's going to read a little bit differently, but the gist is going to be the same. Why do you see the splinter which is in your brother's eye, and do not feel the beam which is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter from your eye, and behold, there is a beam in your own eye? O hypocrite, first take out the beam from your own eye, and then you will see clearly how to get the splinter from your brother's eye. We've got a few things going on in this scripture. We've got eyes, we've got splinters, we've got beams, and then we've got a hypocrite. Let's start out with the eye. The eye has to do with how we see the world. It's our vision. How do we see things? Jesus is telling us that the way that we look at issues, the way that we look at problems, that's going to affect how we deal with them. He's also saying we've got this great big beam that's in our eye, but what is it we're choosing to focus on? It's that tiny splinter that's on the person out there. Jesus is also telling us that we need to deal with our own stuff first. We need to get rid of that great big beam that's blocking us from seeing things clearly. And once we get rid of that big beam, then we can see clearly how to correct what's going on with the other person. Because when we don't do that, we're a hypocrite. For those of you who've been in New Thought for a while, you know that we have the concept of the ego. The ego is something that we're born into when we come into this human existence. We all have got one. And the purpose of the ego is to help us navigate our way through life and to protect us. But because we let the ego run things for so long, the ego feels like it's in charge, and it really thinks it's its own person. The ego does not want to give up. The ego is afraid of having to go away. So the ego does what it can to protect itself. But it's not our real self. Our real self is the Christ that lives within us. The real self is that divinity, that part of us that is made in the image and the likeness of God. That's the part that we need to connect with. But do we do it? No, we let the ego continue to run things. And the ego is very insecure. The ego is afraid. The ego manufactures evidence, false evidence, appearing real, and tells you that things are working a certain way, that they appear a certain way, and that they're true. But in reality, they're not. It's out of fear that the ego tries to protect itself, and it causes us to act in some of the most ill ways that we can act. We get this thing that we have to be right. We're taught that we have to be right from the time that we're small kids, from the time that we're like this, coming up. And it really gets started in our families, it gets started in school. And in this competitive society, it's important to be right. Being right is associated with status. It's associated with being a winner. It's associated with being on top. It's associated with everything that the world and the society values. Nobody wants to be a loser, because to be a loser is to be a failure. And you're a loser if you're wrong. And that's at the crux of the relationship problems that we have. Because we are afraid that if we let go and we connect with that spirit that's within us, that we can't handle it. That we can't handle what it is that we need to do, that somehow we're going to fail. The biggest sin that we can have is believing that there is something stronger, more powerful than the presence and the power of God that dwells in us. The thing is that we need to start with ourselves. We need to come back to principle and recognize that God is love, that God is everywhere present, equally present, that God lives in us and that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, we are loved. And scriptures tell us in 1 John that perfect love casts out fear. Because you see, fear and love cannot exist at the same time. When you are loving yourself, when you're loving who you are and what you are, you accept yourself. And when you accept yourself and you're comfortable with who you are, then you can accept the other person where they are. And there's no need for this power play, for this struggle, because we're comfortable with who we are, because we know that God has got us, that God is expressing through us, and we know that no matter what happens, that everything is going to be all right. So we've got this ego that we're dealing with. With the ego, we've got to remove this big beam that's blocking our eyesight, because it's causing us to see the world in a certain way. So we've got to get back to principle. And not only recognize that the presence and the power of God lives in us, but it lives in everybody. And once we realize that, we know that there's nothing to fear from the other person, because it's God talking to God. It's the individualized expression of divinity that each of us is, that we have this sharing of love between us and the other person. But now, once we take care of things for ourselves, the other person may not be ready to accept it. The thing is that when we're dealing with people, and once we get past the ego and start to live out of a sense of love, we need to learn how to communicate with people. And that communication is what we call heart-to-heart communication. Now, I may not speak your language. Maybe you speak Spanish, maybe you speak French, maybe you speak Chinese, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that when you are expressing from your heart, I understand that. Luke 6:45 says, "A good man brings out good things from the good treasure of his heart, and a bad man from the bad treasure of his heart brings out bad things. For from the abundance of the heart, the lips speak." So what a person is really saying to you, what's coming out of their mouths, are an expression of what's in their heart. And sometimes it comes out differently than what's in their heart. And we very often do that, especially with interactions between men and women. We think differently. We're wired differently. But the thing is the heart-to-heart communication. So when we have an understanding heart, we're listening from our spiritual hearts. And see, that's the problem with us. When we have conversations, we hear with the head and we react from the heart. When instead, we should be listening with our hearts and then reacting with our minds. What I mean is that we hear the words coming out of a person's mouths, and then we react with our hearts. Oh no, she didn't say that. Who does this person think that they are? And instead, if we listen heart to heart, we'd be able to see what comes up for me. How am I feeling about what the person said? Because what comes up in you is very often what that person is experiencing. You have that heart-to-heart communication. If the person complains to you, and they complain bitterly to you, it may not be that they're criticizing you. It may be that they care so much that they feel that they have to say something. They may not have the words to express it in a way that it's going to work for you. But your job as a person listening with the understanding heart is to have that spirit-to-spirit connection and to listen with your heart so that you get the message clearly, and then you take it and think about it rationally. This is what the person is really saying to me. I understand it now. Let me draw on my spiritual faculty of wisdom and figure out the best way to move forward with this. What is the real issue here? What's the thing that we're really trying to accomplish? We're not trying to accomplish about who's right and who's wrong. I may end up being right, but I'm never going to win. And I want to make sure that you hear something very carefully that I'm saying. I'm not saying to listen to your heart. I'm saying to listen with your heart. And there's a big difference. Because too many of us have been listening to our hearts. We've been looking at what we hear and see with our heads and reacting from our hearts, and it's gotten us into trouble. And it's not until we get our hearts in line with our thinking and that we learn how to draw on the divinity that's in us that we have to be careful about listening to our hearts. It's listening with the heart and reacting from the mind that will help us determine the correct course of action in any relationship that we have. Because in the end, it's all about your relationship with you and how you go through this life to unfold. We come across people for a season, for a reason, and for some people for a lifetime. We come into this world for the unfoldment of our souls. Each person has something of value, something useful to share with us. Even though when it seems that it's a negative situation, that person is your teacher. They may come into your lives for just a moment and bam, just as soon as they've done what they need to do, they're gone. They move out of our lives. And sometimes those lessons that they bring to us are lessons that are hurtful. But we needed that lesson to come to us in that way because that's the only way that Spirit could get our attention and give us what it is that we need. Then we have those people that come into our lives for a season. They stick around with us for a while and they help us to nurture whatever it is that we need to learn. And sometimes those relationships are loving, and sometimes those relationships seem unloving. But when we get what we need from that person moves on in out of our lives. So if you've got somebody in your life that is a thorn in your life, if you've got somebody in your life that is causing you angst and is causing you pain, take a step back and ask yourself, what is it that's happening with me? What is it that I need to learn from this? We're responsible for ourselves and what it is that we need to do. We can give other people what they need to have. We can show them. But it's up to them to manage their own lives and for them to accept their divinity and to express it. And so you, with your wisdom, have to use your minds and ask yourself, is this person doing and being the things that I need to have in my life? Is this person acting negatively? Is there something that I need to remove from my consciousness? And once I've done it, and I remove the emotions out of it, is this person for my highest and best good? And maybe you may find that that person is, and maybe you may find that person is not. And at that particular point, if you find that that person is not, you need to move forward with love and to move away from that person and to let them go. And sometimes that's not easy because that person is living out of their ego. That person is living out of their hurt. And that person is living out of their pain. And they may try to hold on to you and to try to keep you in their life and to keep the drama going. But once again, in Spirit family, recognize who you are, whose you are, and what you are. That you are a spiritual being made in the image and likeness of God. Continue to bless them as hard as it gets. Stand on your truth, live on your truth. Know the truth, and know that God will bring everything through and bring this to fruition in a way that's going to be peaceful and harmonious. So in Spirit family, yes, relationships can be difficult. They can be challenging. And they can indeed sometimes seem like they're impossible to deal with. But live the truth that you know. Be the divine spiritual being that you were created to be. And Spirit will work everything through for you. I love each and every one of you. Have a wonderful relationship.